want to make sure that people hear this part that was unanimously agreed to. The Commission said, and I quote, recommends to Congress that it remove the requirement that LPFM stations protect full power stations operating on third adjacent channels. Interference isn't a question anymore. Not only did the $2 million study the FCC Commission prove it, but the fact that big broadcasters want to use the same technology as LPFM on those same frequencies for repeating their signals proves it too. If anything, having new local non-commercial options might keep people listening to free FM radio across the dial. So again, FCC to Congress, fix the anti-LPFM law. Mr. Chairman, I hope we can expect movement on my bill to do just that early next year, and I want to thank my friend Mr. Terry, who's co-sponsored that bill with me. Now, Commissioner Edelstein, very briefly, the Commission was supposed to vote last week on whether or not cable operators have met the 70-70 rule, the market penetration and take rate standard. What happened?
Well, we did vote on a report that was radically altered. The initial draft suggested that the 70-70 report had been met, and it wasn't until the night before the meeting that I learned from our own internal data, that I was given our own internal data that I'd asked for earlier that day that had been omitted from the earlier draft for the first time in history. After many years of our own internal data being included, it was dropped, that in fact we determined that the 70-70 test had not been met.
Sounds like a question of process. I want to piggyback on top of questions of process, because I think another important question of process is a memo on cross-ownership dated June 15th, 2006, from the FCC's chief economist. And it begins like this, Mr. Chairman. It says, this document is an attempt to share some thoughts and ideas I have about how the FCC can approach relaxing newspaper broadcast cross-ownership restrictions. And then it lays out the work that would need to be done to justify lifting the cross-ownership rule. Now, this was June 15, 2006. Just 6 days later, the FCC announces that it was going to look into media ownership and commission some studies and hold public hearings and, quote, invite comment on how the Commission should address radio, television, and newspaper broadcast cross-ownership issues. Mr. Chairman, can I ask unanimous consent that these be entered into the record for today's hearing, both the paper on cross-ownership rule and the press release from a week later?
Without objection, it will be included in the record.
Thank you. Chairman Martin, a more cynical person than I, might ask the question, did you know what you wanted to do on June 15, 2006? I would hope that overturning cross-ownership rules wasn't a foregone conclusion, that you actually looked at studies, saw what they said, went to the field hearings, listened to the public and the stakeholders, and then announced your rule. And my question is, Chairman Martin, did your chief economist prepare similar papers that took sides on other media ownership rules before the FCC announced it was going to seek comment and pay for studies?
I think that I think that it's fair that I did have an idea of what I thought the Commission should end up doing in June, and that is to implement the law that the rule that the Commission had already adopted and had been affirmed by the Third Circuit.
But my question is, did your economist prepare other studies on other issues?
Well, I was first trying to answer the first, I think you said more cynical question, and that is that the cross-ownership rule, the ban on cross-ownership, had already been eliminated. The Commission had said the ban was no longer appropriate, and the Third Circuit had already said, by the time that memo was produced, the ban was no longer appropriate. As a result, we were going to do some kind of ownership relaxation for cross-ownership because the ban was no longer appropriate. As a result, I did ask the staff to try to determine how we were going to do ownership studies to make a new determination of where that line should be drawn, so that they didn't accuse us of doing it arbitrarily. But I'm not aware.
Has this been done in any other instance?
The memo? No, we didn't do a memo on any of the other rules because none of the other rules had going into the rulemaking. None of the other rules had a presumption.
Okay, thank you very much.
The one rule was that the courts had.
We have 8 minutes, Mr. Chairman, not 5, just so you know. Is that from 8? Okay, I want to move on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Martin, in my years on the committee, I've learned a lot from Chairman Dingell, including this technique. So a simple yes or no will suffice to the following questions. In Seattle hearing last month, you referred to the publisher of the Seattle Times, Frank Blethen, as being a vocal proponent of keeping the rules the way they are. And you also said, and I quote, "I think you have to put that in the context of almost every newspaper in the country having cutbacks, and that those will continue until they can diversify their media holdings and spread their cost over other outlets." Do you still agree with that statement? It's just a yes or no question.
I haven't seen, I can't say for sure that I said it, but yes, I think I generally agree with it.
Are you aware that Dean Singleton, owner of the York Daily Record and dozens of other papers, the Media News Group, said that the newspaper industry is, quote, very, very, very profitable, and it will continue to be for a long time?
I'm not aware that he said it, but I'm not. But
he did say that. Are you aware in late October that he also said that more people read the Sunday newspaper than watch the Super Bowl, and that newspapers are, quote, holding up better than most other media?
No, I'm not aware that.
He said that too. Are you aware that Scarborough Research, a firm that works closely with the Newspaper Association of America, their report concluded that, and I quote, "They continue to find that when online readers are considered, the story of newspaper readership for many papers transforms from one of slow, steady decline to one of vibrancy and growth."
I'm sorry, what was was the question? Have I seen that report? I haven't seen that report, no.
Are you aware that the Mid-Atlantic Community Papers Association opposes lifting the cross-ownership rule?
I think someone from that group testified at one of our hearings, I believe.
Thank you. Are you aware that the Midwest Free Community Papers opposes lifting the cross-ownership rule?
I apologize. It may have been the Midwest, not the Mid-Atlantic, that testified in Chicago.
Are you aware that the Association of Free Community Papers opposes lifting the cross-ownership rule?
Yes.
Are you aware that the Independent Free Papers Association opposes lifting the cross-ownership rule?
No, I haven't heard of that association.
They are. Are you aware that the Community Papers of Michigan opposes lifting the cross-ownership rule?
No.
How about the Free Community Papers of New York?
I knew the Free Community Papers Association was.
The Free Community Papers of New England?
No.
The Texas Community Newspapers Association?
No.
The Wisconsin Community Papers Association?
No.
The National Newspaper Publishers Association, also known as the Black Press of America, opposes lifting the cross-ownership rule. Did you know that?
I believe they were at the Chicago hearing. I think a representative.
Are you aware the National Association of Hispanic Publishers opposes lifting the cross-ownership rule?
I think so, yes.
Thank you. Now, let me get to the hearings. We had one in Pennsylvania. It was in Harrisburg. I remember frantically calling about a week before that hearing to try to find out what time it was and get the details. One of the things that Commissioner Kopp said struck me particularly about the dumbing down of America. You know that you had this hearing in Harrisburg. Only one newspaper, Harrisburg Patriot, made an effort to cover that story. AP did a wire on it, but only the broadcast trades journals picked that up. Nothing in the news media groups, York Daily Record, Lebanon Daily, or any other newspaper in the state of Pennsylvania. But every one of those papers ran a 5-paragraph AP wire story on Hugh Hefner's belief that Anna Nicole Smith's body should be buried in the Bahamas. You talk about the dumbing down of America, and you can see why many people, Commissioner Kopp and myself, are concerned. I'm going to skip my last question because I want to get to my conclusion, Mr. Chairman, if you will indulge me.
I'm sure it's going to be great.
I know we have lots of questions about process here, and I agree with Chairman Dingell that the vote on media ownership needs to be given complete analysis and reflection. I'm not sure if that's possible to do by the end of this year. I read what's driving the transfer, what's driving it is the transfer of the Tribune Company to a private owner. I understand the chairman has proposed the commission will deny the waivers, but if the Tribune sues the SEC, it gets an automatic waiver. That doesn't sound right to me. I would be interested in hearing from the commissioners if they've ever seen any process like that before. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I'm withholding judgment on media ownership rules, but I'm really concerned with how the FCC got here. And I think we need more time to take a look at this process. December 18th seems way too short of a time. The Senate has already passed a bipartisan bill. I think we may need to do that in the House, and I thank the chairman for his indulgence.
The gentleman's time has expired.